What if I told you? One of the coldest wars in history wasn't fought by superpowers, but by 4 million farmers, loggers, and ski troops who made Stalin bleed. They had no tanks, no air superiority, no chance, and yet they stopped the Red Army in its tracks. This isn't just a war story, it's a blueprint for survival, for grit, for something the world calls Sisu. And what if I told you? The effects of this frozen war are still shaping the battlefield today, from NATO's Arctic drills to Putin's next move. This is the war you were never taught in school. 25 moments, 25 turning points, and one tiny country that said, not one step back. Stay with me, because by the end of this story, you'll never see Finland the same way again. What happens when a tiny nation of farmers and hunters takes on one of the largest armies the world has ever seen? You'd expect a massacre, a steamroll, a one-week surrender, maybe two. But in late 1939, something unbelievable happened. The Soviet Union, with 500,000 men, thousands of tanks, endless artillery, invaded Finland. Stalin thought he'd take Helsinki by Christmas, but instead, his Red Army got stuck, frozen, hunted, humiliated, and what followed became one of the most incredible and forgotten underdog stories in military history. This is the Winter War. And if you think you know war history, this one will shock you. Because how did a country with barely any tanks, no modern air force, and soldiers wearing hand-knitted gloves stop Stalin's war machine cold in its tracks? How did Finland, a country smaller than California, manage to inflict over 300,000 Soviet casualties using nothing but skis, snow, and savage tactics? And why did this tiny war just over 100 days long change the course of World War II itself? Stick with us, because this isn't just about battles. It's about survival, leadership, strategy, and the raw will of a people who refuse to surrender. In the next chapter, we'll uncover why Stalin even wanted Finland in the first place and what secret deal with Nazi Germany made this invasion possible. But first, ask yourself, if you were surrounded by snow, outnumbered 4-1, and had no help coming, would you fight anyway? The Finns did, and it changed everything. What did Stalin see in the icy forests of Finland that made him willing to risk global condemnation and humiliation? Stay tuned. Why the USSR wanted. So why did Stalin, the man who had just carved up Poland with Hitler, suddenly set his sights on tiny, snow-covered Finland? Was it about ideology? Land? Revenge? Or was it something more strategic? Let's rewind. It's 1939. Europe is on fire. Nazi Germany has invaded Poland from the west. But from the east, the Soviet Union invades too. How? Why? Because of a secret deal. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. On paper, it was a non-aggression treaty between Hitler and Stalin. But the real bombshell was hidden in the fine print. A secret protocol. One that split Eastern Europe like a mafia territory map. The Baltics? Stalin's. Eastern Poland? Stalin's. Finland? Also Stalin's. But why? Why did Stalin care about Finland, a country that had only been independent for 22 years? Here's the answer. Leningrad. Stalin's beloved city was only 20 miles from the Finnish border. He feared, maybe rightly, that if Germany invaded from the north, Finland would be a launching pad for a Nazi attack. So he demanded a buffer zone. He asked Finland to give up land, allow Soviet bases, and help protect Leningrad. The Finns said, no thanks. They weren't buying the protection lie. They saw it for what it was, a takeover in slow motion. And when diplomacy failed, Stalin sent tanks. But here's the twist. He didn't just send an army. He sent a message to the world. We can invade whoever we want. What he didn't expect, that Finland would say, not today. The sky turned black. Bombs fell on Helsinki. But what Stalin thought would be a quick campaign turned into a frozen nightmare. Up next, how the Red Army invaded and how the world responded. The real story of the Winter War, continuing with the same suspenseful, immersive tone. This section dives into the start of the Soviet invasion, setting the stage for Finland's astonishing resistance. The Soviet invasion begins November 30th, 1939. The silence over Helsinki shattered. Just before dawn, the sky filled with shadows, Soviet bombers flying low, engines howling like wolves in the dark. The first bombs hit the capital. Not military targets, but civilians. Homes, hospitals, schools. The city burned. Over 90 people were killed on day one. Stalin claimed he was liberating Finland. But this was no liberation. It was shock and awe, Soviet style. The Red Army stormed across the border in 3 directions. Through the Karelian Isthmus, aiming straight for Helsinki, north towards Suomussalmi, cutting through dense forests, and across the frigid Arctic, where roads didn't even exist. Stalin expected the Finns to collapse, just like Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania had. He even installed a puppet government before the war started, a fake People's Republic, led by a Finnish communist who hadn't lived in Finland in years. But Stalin had miscalculated one thing. Finns don't break. They didn't retreat. They didn't panic. They mobilized. Within days, over 300,000 Finnish men, farmers, students, even teenagers were on the front lines. Some wore mismatched uniforms. Others had hand-me-down rifles from World War I. But they all had one thing in common: a reason to fight. And that, as we'll see next, would make all the difference. What happens when your enemy wears white, moves silently through forests, and disappears on skis? Up next, how Finland turned snow into a weapon and began one of the most effective guerrilla campaigns in history. Guerrilla warfare in the snow. Imagine this. You're a Soviet soldier. It's minus 40 degrees Celsius. Your tank won't start. Your boots are thin. The forests are endless. And suddenly, you're being hunted, but not by an army, by ghosts in white. Finland didn't just fight, it fought smart. They knew they couldn't match the Red Army in numbers or firepower. So they used the one weapon Stalin couldn't control: the land itself, the forests, the snow, the bitter, bone-breaking cold. Finnish soldiers wore all-white camouflage. They moved in silence. On skis, they could glide through frozen woods, strike with precision, and disappear before the Soviets even knew where the shots came from. No tanks, no air support, just rifles, grenades, and the element of surprise. Their most powerful tactic? The Mahti maneuver. Instead of head-on battles, the Finns would split Soviet columns into smaller, isolated pockets called Mahtis and wipe them out one by one. Soviet convoys were long, slow, and stuck on narrow forest roads, and the Finns cut them up like pieces of firewood. No supplies, no retreat, no mercy. This wasn't just guerrilla warfare. It was surgical destruction, carried out by farmers and foresters who knew every inch of the terrain. And here's the craziest part. It worked. Thousands of Soviet troops died, not just from bullets, but from frostbite, starvation, and panic. Up next, we'll go into specific battles where these tactics humiliated the Red Army, starting with one of the most shocking: the Battle of Suomussalmi. Trust us, you do not want to miss this one. The Battle of Suomussalmi, Finland's impossible victory. It was one of the most lopsided battles in modern warfare. A Soviet force over 45,000 strong, armed with tanks, artillery, and supplies, facing just 11,000 Finnish defenders, outnumbered 4-1. No tanks, no winter uniforms, just skis, bolt-action rifles, and a terrifying level of determination. This is the Battle of Suomussalmi, and what happened here shocked the entire world. The Soviets' goal? Cut Finland in half by seizing the town of Suomussalmi and pushing west to the Gulf of Bothnia. But there was one problem. The roads? Narrow, icy, twisting through thick pine forests. Perfect for an ambush. The Finnish plan was brilliant in its simplicity. First, let the Soviets march in. Then, slice them into pieces. Finnish ski troops launched constant raids on the Soviet supply lines. They struck at night, burned food convoys, stole ammunition. In some cases, they even wore captured Soviet uniforms to infiltrate camps. The Soviet soldiers, many of them young conscripts, began to starve. Sleep-deprived, freezing, surrounded. One division was completely encircled. The other? Destroyed in retreat. Out of 45,000 Soviet troops, only a few thousand survived. The rest were killed, captured, or froze to death in the snow. Finnish losses? Just 700 killed. The world took notice. A nation of lumberjacks had just crushed the Red Army. So what did Stalin do next? He doubled down. The Battle of Rate Road, where frozen death awaited thousands more Soviet troops. The Battle of Rate Road, the road of frozen death. Imagine a road 30 kilometers long, covered in snow, surrounded by dense, silent forest. Now imagine over 25,000 Soviet soldiers marching down that road. Tired, hungry, frostbitten. What they didn't know, they were walking into a graveyard. This was Rate Road, and what happened here has been called one of the most effective ambushes in modern warfare. After the disaster at Suomussalmi, Soviet forces tried to retreat east back toward the Soviet border. But the Finns? They were already waiting. On skis. In the trees. With Molotov cocktails and bolt-action rifles. The Soviet column stretched for miles, tanks, trucks, troops, and horses too long to defend, too slow to turn. And then, the trap was sprung. The Finns attacked in small, fast-moving units, slicing the convoy into smaller mahdi's, just like before. They destroyed vehicles, set supply wagons on fire, and cut communication lines so no one could call for help. Soviet soldiers panicked. Many froze in place. Some tried to run through waist-deep snow. Others simply dropped from exhaustion and never got back up. When it was over, the snow was red. Over 17,000 Soviet troops dead in just a few days. Some called it a victory. Others called it a massacre. One thing's certain. Great Road proved that numbers don't matter when your enemy is smarter, faster, and knows the land like a second skin. But despite these humiliating losses, Stalin wasn't done. He had millions more men to throw at Finland. And soon, he would change tactics. Stalin's Great Purge backfires. Stalin's Red Army should have crushed Finland. More men, more tanks, more planes. So why did it lose battle after battle? To farmers on skis? The answer? Stalin had already destroyed his own army before the war even began. In the late 1930s, Stalin launched the Great Purge, a political bloodbath fueled by fear and paranoia. He didn't trust his generals, or his officers, or even his own inner circle. So he eliminated them. Over 30,000 military officers were arrested, executed, or sent to the gulags. Entire chains of command wiped out overnight. Brilliant strategists gone. Veteran commanders replaced by yes-men with zero battlefield experience. By the time the USSR invaded Finland in 1939, the Red Army wasn't led by warriors. It was led by survivors, men who said, "Yes, Comrade Stalin," to avoid a bullet. And the results were catastrophic. Troops were poorly trained. Logistics collapsed in the cold. Tactical decisions made no sense. Soviet soldiers were sent into forests with no winter gear and no maps. One Soviet unit walked in circles for 2 weeks, thinking they were advancing. And Stalin? He refused to believe the reports. He thought his men were exaggerating, or worse, conspiring. But the truth was bleeding into the snow by the thousands. The Great Purge hadn't made the Red Army stronger. It made it blind. The legend of Simo Häyhä, the White Death. One man, one rifle, over 500 kills. You've heard of snipers, but you've never heard of anyone like him. Simo Häyhä, the White Death. One man, one rifle, no scope. Over 500 confirmed kills in just under 100 days. Who was he? His enemies called him Beljasmert, the White Death. His name was Simo Häyhä, a quiet Finnish farmer who barely stood 5 feet 3 inches. He wasn't a trained assassin. He didn't seek glory. But when the Soviets invaded his homeland, he picked up his rifle and disappeared into the snow. He wore all white. No visible gear. No flash, no noise, no trace. He didn't even use a scope. Why? Because in sub-zero temperatures, scopes could fog up or reflect sunlight, revealing your position. So he aimed through iron sights and never missed. Every day, Simo crawled into the woods, built a snow mound to steady his rifle, and waited. He packed snow into his mouth to hide his breath from steaming in the cold. And then he hunted. Soviet officers, scouts, machine gunners, gone with a single, silent shot. The Red Army grew terrified. Entire units were ordered to kill just one man. They fired mortars, artillery, and even launched full-on assaults, just to stop him. One day, they nearly did. A Soviet soldier shot Simo in the face with an explosive round. His jaw was shattered. He was left in a coma. But guess what? He survived. And he woke up on the day peace was signed. Simo Häyhä never bragged, never asked for medals. But history will remember him as the deadliest sniper of all time, a ghost in the snow who defended his country with nothing but grit, patience, and a rifle older than he was. The Battle of Taipale, trench warfare in frozen hell. You've seen ambushes. You've seen ski troops vanish into the trees. But now, the war changes. This is Taipale, where tactics end and pure endurance begins. On the Karelian Isthmus, the Soviet army launched wave after wave of assaults on Finnish trenches. Their goal? Break through to Helsinki. Their method? Throw thousands of men at the line no matter the cost. This wasn't ski warfare anymore. It was mud, blood, barbed wire, Trenches filled with snow, frozen corpses, and silence between artillery strikes. For over 2 months, Finnish troops dug in holding a defensive line with no tanks, no air support, and almost no sleep. Soviet forces launched repeated frontal attacks, first with rifles, then with flamethrowers. But the Finns? They didn't budge. They rotated units every 5 to 7 days to prevent total breakdown. And when shells ran low, they fired only when they saw the whites of enemy eyes. Some days, Soviet troops charged 6 times before noon. Finnish soldiers used everything they had, including captured Soviet weapons and homemade grenades. The snow turned red. The ground was so cold, bodies froze where they fell. And yet, the line held. One Finnish officer described Taipale as, not a battle, a test of who could survive longer. In the end, Finland survived, but just barely. So what now? The Soviets weren't giving up, and Finland was starting to run out of everything. The Soviet reinforcements arrive, and the tide begins to turn. The Soviet comeback. Stalin brings the hammer. For weeks, Finland had humiliated the Red Army. Thousands of Soviet troops frozen, lost, or slaughtered in the woods. Stalin had enough. This time, he wasn't sending conscripts and broken maps. He was sending artillery, armor, and vengeance. By February 1940, the Red Army was back, but this time with a new plan. Stalin replaced incompetent commanders with hardened veterans. He sent more experienced divisions, modern tanks, and thousands of tons of ammunition to the front. And most importantly, he stopped underestimating the Finns. The Soviets unleashed a blistering artillery campaign on the Karelian Isthmus. It wasn't precision fire. It was a hammer designed to flatten trenches, forests, bunkers, and morale. The front lines trembled. Finnish soldiers described the shelling as a metal storm. And when the shelling stopped, the Soviet tanks rolled in. This time, the Soviet troops weren't confused or lost. They had clear objectives, better winter gear, and an order from Stalin himself. Break Finland, or die trying. Finnish lines began to collapse under pressure. Outgunned, outnumbered, exhausted. Ammunition was critically low. Food supplies were shrinking, and there were no reinforcements coming. The international community? Still watching from the sidelines. Finland had survived the first storm. But now, the real weight of Soviet power was crashing down. So what do you do when you've fought like lions but the walls are closing in? The Moscow Peace Treaty, the price of survival. The peace treaty, Finland's painful deal with Stalin. By March 1940, the snow was still falling, but the silence on the Finnish front lines? That was new. The war was ending. Finland had done the impossible. Held off the Red Army for over 100 days. Inflicted hundreds of thousands of casualties. Defended its capital, its people, and its pride. But there was a bitter truth. Finland was running out of everything. Ammunition, food, soldiers. Even the legendary Finnish morale had begun to crack. Meanwhile, Stalin had millions more troops ready to send. And now, his army had adapted, improved, hardened. The final decision wasn't military. It was existential. Survive as a nation, or be wiped off the map. On March 13, 1940, Finland signed the Moscow Peace Treaty. And the price? Brutal. Finland ceded 11% of its territory, including parts of Karelia. Lost access to vital industry and infrastructure. Over 400,000 Finnish citizens became refugees overnight, forced to abandon homes, farms, graves, and generations of history. But there's something else they didn't lose. Their independence. Unlike Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, Finland remained free. Stalin got his buffer zone, but not the victory he wanted. For the rest of the world, it was just another treaty. But for Finland, it was survival bought at a terrible price. How this small war changed World War II forever. The global shock, why Hitler took notes. To the world, the Winter War seemed like a side story. A brutal but local conflict between a superpower and a stubborn little neighbor. But behind the scenes, one man was watching every snowy step very closely. That man was Adolf Hitler. And what he saw changed everything. Hitler had always feared the Red Army. The Soviets had more troops, more tanks, more land. But in Finland, that army looked broken. He saw columns of Soviet tanks burned by homemade bombs. Elite Soviet divisions destroyed by farmers and skis. Commanders that couldn't coordinate basic attacks. Hitler didn't just take notes. He got ideas. The failures of the Red Army in Finland convinced him of something critical. The Soviets are weaker than we thought. One German general even wrote, "If 3 million Russians can't take Finland, maybe they can't stop us either." Less than 16 months later, Hitler would test that theory with Operation Barbarossa, the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. It would become the largest military campaign in history. And it might not have happened, at least not so soon, if Finland hadn't exposed the cracks in Stalin's war machine. So yes, Finland lost land, but it dealt the Red Army a psychological defeat that echoed across Europe. One snowy war, one small country, and one giant empire, embarrassed in front of the world. Finland fights again the continuation war. You'd think after surviving the Winter War, after standing toe-to-toe with Stalin, Finland would rest. But history had one more plot twist. Just 1 year later, Finland was back at war. And this time, they were fighting with Nazi Germany against the Soviet Union. Sound shocking? It was. But for Finland, this wasn't about Hitler. It was about revenge and recovery. After the Moscow Peace Treaty, Finland had lost a huge chunk of its land, and nearly 500,000 of its citizens had become refugees. When Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa in 1941, invading the Soviet Union, Finland saw an opportunity. Reclaim lost territory, push the Soviets out, maybe even get peace on their own terms. So they joined what's now called the Continuation War. But make no mistake, Finland never formally joined the Axis. No swastikas, no Nazi parades. They refused to hand over Jews. They had their own goals and their own front. And at first, it worked. Finnish forces pushed deep into Soviet-held Karelia. They recaptured lost cities. Morale soared. But as the tide of World War II turned against Germany, Finland found itself stuck. Again, facing Soviet retribution and isolation from the Allies. What came next was brutal diplomacy, bitter fighting, and one last push to avoid complete destruction. Coming up, the endgame: how Finland escaped Soviet occupation a second time. The final gamble: peace without surrender. The year is 1944. Nazi Germany is collapsing. The Red Army is surging westward. And Finland? It's in the crosshairs again. Stalin wants payback, not just for the Winter War, but for the Continuation War too. The Soviets launch a massive new offensive, hitting Finnish defenses along the Karelian Isthmus again. Thousands of shells rain down. Soviet tanks swarm. The world braces for Finland's final defeat. But somehow, the Finns hold the line. At battles like Taliantala, they pull off another miracle, repelling wave after wave of Soviet assaults using artillery coordination, terrain knowledge, and sheer grit. It becomes the largest battle in Nordic history and a last stand for national survival. But here's where Finland does something few nations ever do in wartime. They switch sides just enough to survive. As Germany crumbles, Finland signs an armistice with the Soviet Union in September 1944. The terms? Expel German troops from Finnish territory. Pay heavy war reparations. Cede more land again. Brutal? Yes. But occupation? No. Finland keeps its independence again. Unlike every other country bordering the Soviet Union, it avoids becoming a Soviet satellite. No communist takeover. No puppet regime. No red flag over Helsinki. Why? Because Finland fought smart and knew when to hold ground and when to make peace. The lessons of Finland: grit, strategy, and survival. So what can we learn from a war fought in snowdrifts, with ski troops, bolt-action rifles, and Molotov cocktails? More than you'd think. Because the Winter War wasn't just about Finland versus the Soviet Union. It was about how a tiny nation refused to kneel and rewrote the rules of resistance. Lesson 1. Terrain is a weapon. Finland turned its forests, lakes, and sub-zero temperatures into military tools. They didn't just survive winter, they weaponized it. Armies today still study how Finland used mobility, camouflage, and weather to turn the battlefield into an ally. Lesson 2. Morale beats machinery. The Red Army had more tanks, planes, and manpower, but Finland had something stronger: unity, purpose, and belief. It's a reminder that war isn't always won by size. Sometimes it's won by spirit. Lesson 3. Know when to fight and when to stop. Finland fought ferociously, but it also knew when to cut losses. It made peace without surrender, and that balance saved the nation. In today's world of endless conflict, that lesson might be the most powerful of all. So yes, Finland lost territory, but it kept its soul, and it showed the world something unforgettable. You don't need to be big. You just need to never back down at the wrong moment. What if Finland had fallen? The alternate history that almost was. Let's rewind. What if things had gone differently? What if Finland hadn't held the line? What if the Soviet tanks had rolled through the snow, all the way to Helsinki? First, Finland would have disappeared. Like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, it would have become a Soviet satellite state, absorbed behind the Iron Curtain before World War II even reached its peak. Its people? Mass deportations, executions, gulags. Its culture? Slowly erased by Sovietization, replaced by red flags and Russian textbooks. Second, Sweden would have panicked. The fall of Finland would have placed the Soviet Union directly on Sweden's border with no buffer zone. Sweden might have been forced to join the Allies early, or even preemptively arm for war, shattering its long-standing neutrality. Third, and perhaps most important, Hitler may have hesitated. If Stalin's Red Army had steamrolled Finland in weeks, the myth of Soviet invincibility would have stayed intact. Hitler may have delayed Operation Barbarossa, or launched it with a very different strategy, or not at all. That changes the timeline of the entire Eastern Front. Maybe millions more would have died, maybe fewer. But here's what we do know. Finland didn't fall. It fought, it bled, and it survived twice. Not because it was powerful, but because it was determined. And that, in the icy pages of history, is a victory that echoes far beyond its borders. How the Winter War forged Finland's national identity. In just 105 days, Finland didn't just fight a war. It defined itself. Before 1939, Finland was a young country independent for only 2 decades after centuries, under Swedish and Russian rule. Many doubted it would survive as a sovereign state. But then came the Winter War, and in fire, ice, and silence, a national identity was born. Ask any Finn today what the war means, and you'll hear one word. Sisu. It has no perfect English translation, but it means unyielding determination, cold courage, and the will to keep going when reason says stop. The Winter War didn't create Sisu. It revealed it to the world. School children in Finland still study the war. Statues of Simo Häyhä stand in quiet corners. The names of fallen ski troops are etched in stone, and every snowstorm reminds them. We held the line. Finland didn't win the Winter War on paper, but it won something deeper. Respect from the world. Pride in its own resilience. A united identity that no treaty could erase. Even in modern conflicts, Finland's defense forces train in the snow. Cold weather is not feared, it's home. And the message sent to any would-be invader? Come if you want. Bring tanks. Bring armies. But remember, we've faced worse. And we're still here. From Winter War to NATO, Finland's modern military strategy. What happens when a country that once fought alone decides never to be alone again? Finland didn't just learn from the Winter War. It built a defense strategy around it. For decades after World War II, Finland walked a fine line. Not aligned with NATO, not openly hostile to the Soviet Union. It was called Finlandization, quiet diplomacy, strategic neutrality. But make no mistake, Finland was always preparing. The Winter War taught one hard truth. If the bear comes back, no one will save you, unless you're ready to save yourself first. So Finland built one of Europe's most efficient militaries per capita. Universal conscription, a massive trained reserve, cold weather units that still train on skis, underground bunkers, and hardened infrastructure across the country. Even during peace, Finland's forests remained war-ready. But then came 2022. Russia invaded Ukraine. The old fear came rushing back. And just like that, Finland made its move. In 2023, it joined NATO. For the first time in history, Finland became part of a mutual defense pact. The message was clear. If you come for us again, we're not alone this time. It's a full circle moment. From solo survival in 1939 to collective defense in 2023, the Winter War didn't just change Finland's past. It shaped its future. Putin, NATO, and the shadow of Finland's snow war. For decades, Russia dismissed Finland as quiet, passive, not a threat. But history? It never forgets. And neither does the Kremlin. When Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine in 2022, he said it was to stop NATO expansion. What he got instead? A 1,300-kilometer NATO border with Finland. The very nation Stalin tried to crush in 1939 is now part of the very alliance Russia fears most. But here's the part that keeps Russian generals awake at night. Finland doesn't bluff. In 1939, it faced annihilation and fought with hunting rifles and Molotovs. In 2024, it fights with F-35s, HIMARS, and NATO war games in Arctic snow. Putin knows that Finland trains every male citizen to fight, maintains one of the world's strongest artillery corps, has a population that remembers occupation and will never accept it. So even if Finland's population is small, the political cost of aggression is now astronomical. And the symbolism? Crushing Ukraine is one thing, but attacking Finland would be like trying to erase a legend. A country that already stared down a superpower once and made it bleed. From Stalin to Putin, the lesson is the same. Invading Finland is never simple and never cheap. Final reflections: how a tiny nation changed the art of war. What does it mean to win when you lose land? What does it mean to survive when the odds say you shouldn't? The Winter War didn't just freeze a battlefield. It reset the world's expectations of what war and resistance could look like. Finland didn't invent new weapons. It didn't outnumber anyone. It simply refused to break. And in doing so, it taught the world three things. 1. Size isn't strength. 2. Nature is a battlefield. 3. A nation's will can be more powerful than its army. Today, military academies across the globe study Finland's tactics. Guerrilla mobility, decentralized defense, camouflage in snow, using local terrain to outthink and outmaneuver a larger foe. Modern nations from Taiwan to Ukraine cite Finland as an example, not of how to destroy an enemy, but of how to survive one. The legend of Simo Hiha, the frozen trenches of Taipei, the maps redrawn in Moscow. These aren't just history. They're warnings. They're manuals. They're reasons why no one takes Finland lightly today. So the next time someone says one country is too small to matter, remind them of the war where a nation of 4 million stopped an empire cold, not for months, but for generations. Forgotten heroes, the ordinary Finns who saved a nation. You've heard about snipers, generals, treaties, and tactics. But what about the ones who never made it into the history books? The farmer who welded tank traps in his barn. The nurse who treated soldiers in a tent at -30 degrees Celsius. The schoolboy who skied 20 miles to deliver ammo. These are the forgotten heroes of the Winter War. When the Soviets invaded, Finland didn't just mobilize soldiers. It mobilized a nation. Women joined the Lahtisvard, Finland's voluntary defense corps. They ran communications, hospitals, and supply chains. They weren't armed, but without them, no one would have survived. Families in rural towns offered shelter to refugees. Civilians built bunkers by hand, laid mines, and cleared ice roads. One young man even used his sled dog team to evacuate wounded men from the front at night, under fire. These people had no medals, no glory, but they were the spine of the war effort. And when peace came, many of them went right back to their fields and shops, as if nothing had happened. But history remembers more than names. It remembers character. And Finland's greatest weapon wasn't in its armory. It was in its people, quietly fierce, impossibly resilient, and never broken. Finland's legacy: unity, survival, respect. What do you call a country that lost territory, but never lost its freedom? A country that faced down a superpower and walked away standing? You call it Finland. The Winter War may have ended in 1940, but its spirit never did. Finland's story became more than a military case study. It became a global metaphor for how the smallest can defy the largest, with the right blend of courage and conviction. The world didn't forget. Historians respected Finland's strategy. Soldiers admired its tenacity. Ordinary people everywhere drew strength from its resilience. Even the Soviet Union, after decades of propaganda, quietly acknowledged one thing: Finland never broke. And internally, something deeper happened. The war unified the nation. Rich or poor, city or village, everyone gave something. They came out of the war not just scarred, but solidified. Finland built one of the world's strongest education systems, a thriving democracy, a society that still values self-reliance, cooperation, and peace through readiness. Finland today is ranked among the most trusted, most stable, and most respected nations on Earth. Why? Because it earned it the hard way. So when we talk about military victories, let's also talk about legacy. And Finland's is one of unity in the face of destruction, survival without surrender, and respect that was never demanded, only demonstrated. They don't just take notes. They rewrite doctrine. The Winter War wasn't just a turning point for Finland. It became a global military case study dissected in war colleges, strategy handbooks, and cold weather boot camps across the world. The Soviets learned the cost of arrogance. Germany learned what not to underestimate. And the rest of the world? They quietly adapted. Lesson 1. Terrain is not a backdrop, it's a weapon. Finnish forces used forests, lakes, and snow not just for cover, but for control. Modern armies now train in asymmetric terrain warfare mimicking Finland's ski units, rapid ambush teams, and hidden fade tactics. Lesson 2. Morale beats math. The Red Army outnumbered Finland 4-1, but numbers couldn't buy commitment. Militaries today emphasize unit cohesion, civic motivation, and psychological warfare like never before. Lesson 3. Decentralized command saves lives. Finnish junior officers were empowered to make real-time decisions. Today's Western doctrines, especially NATO, prioritized this flexibility over rigid top-down orders. Lesson 4. Cold weather warfare is a specialty. NATO now conducts Arctic drills annually. U.S. Marines train in Norway. Even China studies winter survival after watching Ukraine. Finland? Still one of the best in the world at it. So the Winter War didn't just echo in history books. It rewired how modern wars are fought, especially when the environment becomes the enemy. The psychological toll what the war did to the Finnish people. War isn't just fought in trenches. It's fought in minds. And sometimes, the worst battles come after the guns go quiet. The Winter War ended in 1940. But for thousands of Finnish soldiers and their families, the war never really ended. Imagine this. You're 18 years old. You've spent 100 days in a frozen forest, fighting tanks with homemade bombs. You've watched friends die in silence, in minus 40 degrees Celsius. And then you go home. But home isn't the same. The house is burned. The border has moved. Your brother is gone. And no one talks about what happened. PTSD wasn't a recognized term in 1940s Finland, but it was everywhere. Soldiers suffered from night terrors, alcoholism, depression, sudden emotional collapse. Families grieved quietly. Widows raised children alone. Refugees from Karelia, over 400,000, had to rebuild lives from scratch. For many, Sisu didn't just mean courage. It meant enduring pain without ever showing it. But there was also resilience. The country came together not just on the battlefield, but in rebuilding. Trauma was buried beneath work, family, duty. Some say that's strength. Others say it left wounds that never healed. And yet, Finland emerged as one of the happiest countries on earth, perhaps because it had seen the worst, and still chose to hope. The myth and the memory why the Winter War still captivates us. Why does this war, short, brutal, and half-frozen, still live in documentaries, strategy rooms, and national memory to this day? Finland's culture of Sisu, the spirit that outlived the war. If there's one word that defines Finland not just in war, but in life, it's Sisu. It's hard to translate. There's no perfect English equivalent, but every Finn knows what it means. Sisu is grit when strength runs out. It's courage without hope. It's the decision to keep going, even when every voice in your head says you can't. During the Winter War, Sisu wasn't just a slogan. It was fuel. Ski troops sleeping in foxholes at minus 40 degrees Celsius? That's Sisu. Villagers dragging artillery through forests? Sisu. Teenagers using glass bottles to stop tanks? Sisu. But here's what's truly remarkable. The war ended. Sisu didn't. Today it lives in Finland's education system. Its world-class healthcare. Its people's quiet confidence and trust in one another. Finns rarely brag. They don't shout. But when challenges come, economic, political, even global, the world watches as Finland calmly tightens its scarf and handles it. In 2024, Sisu is part of global leadership seminars, motivational talks, even psychology research. But in Finland, it's not a strategy. It's who they are. So if you remember nothing else from this documentary, remember this. You don't need to be the biggest to be unbreakable. You just need Sisu. This has been Combat Inside Alpha. Thank you for walking through 25 chapters of frost, fire, and fearlessness. If this journey inspired you, like, comment, and subscribe. And never forget, legends aren't born from victory. They're born from refusal to quit.